Hello everyone and welcome to this video on procurement planning. So procurement planning often is one of the first things in the procurement cycle, and it's once you've identified that there is a need for something, so a need for some kind of input that could possibly be satisfied through procurement activities, that should trigger the start of the procurement cycle, and then should start the process of procurement planning. So this is quite a broad range of things. It includes deciding whether you are actually going to procure your input for your operation or your project, or whether you're going to decide to satisfy that need for that input internally, so i.e. make or buy the good, item, component, or service, or whatever your particular input is. How you're going to go about procuring, exactly what you're going to procure, which really what we mean is not just the general need for an input, but the exact features, characteristics, quality requirements, and so on of the item or the thing you're procuring, as well as going through and understanding some of the major procurement models that you could use and major ways of going about procurement. All of this needs to be considered quite carefully at this procurement planning stage, so right at the beginning of the procurement cycle. The real goal with a well designed and well executed set of activities at the procurement planning stage is that you've really considered carefully whether this input which needs to be acquired really should be procured from outside, to have a very strong idea of how you're going to go about procuring this item, or input rather, a careful consideration of what exactly is needed. So aside from just the input, the features, characteristics, conditions, situation surrounding the procurement itself, all of this should be carefully considered. And because we love documentation in both project and operations management, then everything should also have a reasonable degree of documentation as well. Now, the exact nature of the documentation will differ from organization to organization. Remember that we spoke about procurement being one of these functions within an organization that is usually quite strongly centralized, which is regulated, has lots of processes and procedures to determine how procurement activities are carried out. And that's because procurement really is a organization-wide concern in terms of concerns over efficiency, as well as concerns over fraud and corruption. So the type of documentation and the style of documentation will change from organization to organization, but the general principle remains. That instead of just going ahead with ad hoc procurement, we want to start the procurement cycle by documenting and considering everything that we possibly can. So this not only will lead to a better procurement outcome, it also allows us to go back and view what the reasoning was, view in documented form the exact statement of work, what the initial intention was. All of this is captured, and that could prove to be really important if we have significant issues with the procurement activities later on in the procurement cycle. So for this, we are going to consider four major areas in a rough order. So we're going to look at make or buy analysis, statement of work, solicitation planning. You'll have to put up with my random accent kicking in every now and again with certain words, and supplier information. So if we start by looking at make or buy analyses, so this is often the very first question that comes up. So within your project or your operation, you identify that there is a particular input which is needed, which is not currently available. Now that could be a component, it could be an entire item itself, it could be materials, it could be labor. So there's a huge range of inputs that could possibly be needed. And you've identified, and this is the need identification. So right at the start, what triggers the procurement cycle is the identification of some kind of need. Once you've identified the need, the first thing which has to be done, and which is sometimes skipped over and leads to unnecessary procurement or inefficient procurement, is really deciding, are we going to produce this in-house? So with the APM, the definition of a make or buy analysis and the central question is quite helpful, is should the items be made in-house, or could we procure them elsewhere at lower cost or better quality? So already when we come to a make or buy decision, we shouldn't be basing this upon, well, we have the ability to create this, so we should develop it in-house, or we want to keep our scope nice and narrow, so therefore we should procure it from outside. We shouldn't be using these kinds of knee-jerk boxes where we just essentially have a clear idea of what we can or cannot do internally within the organization and place it within there, but rather actually consider the cost ramifications and consider the quality requirements. So there could be a need identification over a particular item where there is actually facilities and the ability to produce that item internally. However, with your particular project or operation, there is just the quality barrier or the requirement for a particular type of quality is not aligned with your internal processes that produce that item. God, this is very abstract. So in another sense, let's say we're generating we're working on a project to generate a pair of shoes, let's say, and we know that for our particular design we want a particular type of lace, and we have the capacity, we produce laces internally, but for this particular shoe or run of shoe production, those laces that we already produce don't meet the quality specification. So in this case, the make or buy analysis is not just predicated on, well, do we already make this or can we make this, but rather can we produce this internally within our cost specification and our quality requirements. As well as this, you've got broader questions of strategy as well. Do we want to be making this particular item? Does this fall within our core competencies, or have we identified that our long-term strategy is actually to develop a supply chain or develop a network of suppliers so we can focus on other elements of the value chain? So that would bring in broader questions of organizational strategy, and that should be a consideration when we're looking at our make or buy decision as well. There may well be items where procuring them from outside may make immediate sense for your project. So it represents minimum delay, it represents acceptable quality, and it represents acceptable cost. However, your long-term organizational strategy may point towards or may require a pivot into a particular field or industry, and that may mean that actually, despite the fact that your project would benefit from procuring this item, it would align with the organizational strategy to develop the internal capability or capacity to develop this item because it fits in with the long-term vision of the organization. So that's also something which really does require a degree of consideration. So we have quite a few things to consider with make or buy analysis. We do have to consider cost and quality. We do have to consider organizational strategy as well. In terms of how we do this practically, well, often it does come down to qualitative analysis and expert judgment, really. So there is no straightforward formula. Yes, when it comes to cost, we certainly do want to involve cost estimates, but even those are going to be relatively broad. This is the first stage of procurement planning, so we're not looking for massively detailed cost estimates, but enough for us to make a justified decision on whether we're going to develop our internal capacity or we're going to procure from outside. Now, if we presume that we've made this make or buy decision and we've decided we're going to procure the item, the next step of our procurement planning is to really develop a strong, detailed statement of work. Now, this is really quite critical for any well planned and well executed procurement cycle. Without a statement of work, which is essentially a statement which lays out all of the relevant details of the input that is required. That may mean the quality specifications, it may mean applicable standards, it may mean the precise details of the acceptance criteria. So what output is acceptable, what isn't, as well as the general scope as well. So anything which is relevant to understanding exactly what is being procured should be in the statement of work. And this serves as a really important foundational document. It's something which will be referred to frequently. It provides a reference point for your team internally, as well as being a reference point for external suppliers, and generally allows all the parties involved to get a strong understanding of what the buyers or the client's expectations actually are regarding the procurement activity. So it's something you really do need to draw up and revisit as and when necessary. Like with many things in project management, it's a good idea to consider the statement of work to be a live document. So it cannot be unilaterally changed once you actually start executing your procurement activity itself and you go out to particular suppliers, but it should remain updated through mutual consent at the latter stages of the procurement cycle. It will transfer over into a contractual form once you've actually completed your supplier selection process. But prior to that, it should be a live document which remains a snapshot of exactly what the procurer or the client needs from the procurement activity. So we can see an example of the kinds of things that would be present in a statement of work here. And we can see that the general scope of work would always be the most important. So what actually is needed. Now, this is, if you look at the phrase work, it may imply that this is to do with actual labor input or work to be carried out, but this would apply to anything. So whether it's a component, an item, anything which is whether physical or intangible, whether a labor input or a physical material input, you would still have a statement of work and you would still list the scope of work to be done, and that would involve anything that is needed to produce the actual deliverable which you're looking for. This example, or really a template, is pretty comprehensive, so it would cover things to do with labor input as well as material input. So it may be that if you're not fussed about the location of work, so you simply need a raw material, then your location of work section in the statement of work may simply just be specifying that it needs to be delivered to a particular location rather than where the work is to be carried out or the materials to be harvested. It may be that you require materials from a particular location or materials from a particular country, but otherwise you still need to specify the delivery point or the handover point as well. The period of performance. So this has to fit into your operational schedule or your project time management schedule. So your expectations regarding when the item is to be produced or the work to be done, and when it needs to be completed by. If you have physical deliverables that need to be produced and handed over to the procurer, then those should be listed quite clearly, as well as their due dates in the deliverable schedule. If you have any standards, so we can go back to quality management here, any quality standards, perhaps industry specific as it says there, or even national standards, or industry or standards from the ISO, for example, the International Standards Organization. Anything which gives a clear sense of what the quality standards required are. Acceptance criteria makes it very clear from very early on what defines acceptable work for this particular procurement activity. And that needs to be clearly laid out and pushed forward early on as well. And then lastly, any special requirements which may or may not be required. And those will obviously be very specific and individualized. Really just a section to include anything else which is necessary to develop a real understanding of what's needed. This looks very detailed and very long if you were to do it, but remember that it does depend on what kind of input you're actually trying to procure. This covers pretty much all of the different types of input, from labor to materials to components. But if you're looking to just specify have a statement of work for labor input, you're not going to use things like deliverable standards. Even applicable standards may be empty as well. Acceptance for criteria will certainly need to be present. Periods of performance, location, and scope would need to be present as well. But you wouldn't be using sections 4 and 5, generally speaking. And that would apply in reverse as well for other types of inputs. So you wouldn't have a huge multi-page document for a statement of work. Statements of work do tend to be a few pages long rather than 10, 15, 20 pages long. So it enables all parties to understand exactly what's there. But this is a starting point. Remember, the binding legal way of establishing all of this will be through the contract, as well as some elements of this will be through service level agreements. But we want to get this down in the statement of work now, so we can actually proceed with the procurement cycle and procurement planning with a clear statement on all of these relevant details. So if we move forward to the next item on our list, so it will be solicitation planning. So we have made our buy decision. In our make or buy analysis, we have a detailed statement of work which clearly lays out our understanding of what needs to be done in order to fulfill our need, our procurement need. So the next stage is to really consider how we're going to go about the supplier selection process. So solicitation is very much about how you're going to approach or generate interest from suppliers in order to make a efficient supplier selection decision and actually award the contract to a particular supplier. So we have to start in several different ways depending on the type of situation we face. So it could be a case of having no preferred supplier. So our solicitation planning really focuses on how we're going to contact suppliers that have the ability to execute the contract, and how we're going to drum up interest in getting various suppliers able to bid or propose for our contract. It could be that you have a particular supplier already in mind, which you feel would fulfill all of the requirements of the statement of work in the best way possible. And then your planning is going to be really revolving around a couple of things, approaching them for the particular contract, but also ensuring that your organizational interests are protected. So if you have a preferred vendor or a preferred supplier, we still really need to make sure that the organizational requirements of preventing fraud and corruption, making sure the process is transparent and documented, ensuring that we're getting good value for money, as well as making sure that we're using our influence in the marketplace wisely. All of these things still need to be protected and considered, and that is something you would do so at this stage as well. Or it may be a situation where you simply aren't aware of any suppliers who could carry out the contract, and therefore we need to consider a process where we work with suppliers to generate some kind of plan for how to tackle the procurement activities. So this could be where there's a novel or new problem being tackled, or there's a novel or new solution being proposed, in which case we need to have a much more complex process of supplier selection where we're developing the solution alongside selecting the best supplier to implement that solution. So we do have several major streams that we could put our solicitation planning into. So if you look at three major ones, so a request of for proposals will be one similar to the scenario just described, where you either have some kind of novel or new need, or there's some kind of outcome which is required by the procurer, and there are several different ways of achieving that outcome. So you're prepared to actually help to hear proposals to achieve that outcome from various different sellers. So you're not mandating the exact execution or the exact what would say kind of conformance specification, but rather you have a performance specification or an outcome specification. You want to understand what the different methods of achieving the satisfaction of your procurement need are, and you're willing to really hear the expertise represented by different suppliers and evaluate different proposals. If, however, you have a really well understood procurement item, let's say you simply need to purchase pens. Now you writing is a necessity, but you're not really going to consider proposals for different types of solutions such as pencils or laser etching or anything else. You simply want a bunch of ballpoint pens. So we've got a well-defined, well-understood procurement activity here, and then you would typically go for a request for quotes instead. You're not looking for a complex solution, you just want to have an evaluation based on price and usually quality standards. Lastly, if you have a large-scale complex procurement need, so if we're not just looking to procure a particular material or item, but actually we want to procure a much larger complex set of things. So this could be actually outsourcing an entire process to a supplier, or outsourcing a large body of complex work. Then you would want to start your solicitation planning and your procurement planning really by involving your suppliers as early as possible. So you would have a multi-tiered bid system or a set of formal negotiations over a lengthy period to make sure that as you are developing your documentation, as you're developing your understanding of what needs to be done, the suppliers are very much a part of that as well. That's really quite typical for any kind of outsourcing activities where we're outsourcing entire processes or functions. That requires careful coordination and careful identification of what really does need to be done and how it should be done. So that's something which does require significant early and frequent supplier input. Right, so the last item that we're going to look at here would just be supplier information. So with supplier information, this is just a nod to the fact that getting hold of suppliers in today's day and age of online web searches may seem obvious and simple, but we are talking in some cases a fairly specialized set of companies and suppliers, and we don't want to simply rely upon search optimization and who's done good SEO to get to the first page of Google results. It is a structural interest of the procurer to have a wide range of potential suppliers involved in a process, rather than simply getting a single acceptable supplier when there's other potential suppliers as well. And we have a huge range of things to go and do this. You'll find industry specific catalogs, typically now industry specific websites and industry publications which contain various adverts and supplier listings. You could go out to tender. So tender would be the announcement of a procurement process placed on a website. So this is particularly used for government contracts which go out to tender on specialist websites, government websites, where the responsibility or the onus is on the suppliers to check, but is publicly posted. Various other directories, trade directories in particular. You have some specialist databases for particular industries where suppliers are a wide range of fairly well-known suppliers will be listed. As well as this, going to exhibitions, visiting, contacting salespeople, going to trade associations, and if we're procuring overseas, then making use of both the UK government and various other governments are also a decent place to go to. So there is a huge range of ways to actually start compiling lists of suppliers and starting our solicitation process. And this is something that we do want to make the best use of. Just going through various search engines or using your own kind of existing knowledge really probably isn't sufficient, because we want to go back to part of the reason why procurement is so regulated and so centralized. And part of that is to make sure that we do cast a net wide. It improves the competitive landscape usually. So we're not just going for the well-known suppliers or suppliers that spend a lot of money on marketing, but we're actually making sure that we're restoring or contributing to the restoration of competitive rivalry, which ultimately benefits the procurer, as well as making sure, again, our documentation and transparency levels are as high as possible. Right, brilliant. So that brings this particular video to an end.